So welcome to the profiling call. What I have, because we've been kind of continuing on a number of the very kind of co-oriented topics, is a little bit of an update, just to talk about like where we've been sitting with the deprecation discussion, because it does impact us on the profiling side of things, that discussion that's been happening in governance. I won't spend too much time on that because we spend quite a bit of time talking through like the nitty-gritties, but just to provide you folks with an update on where that sits. We have kept putting off our conversation around the contributing section because we are getting into topics that are, you know, in the weeds and fun and challenging. So I actually changed the agenda items, the direction. I figured we might start there and then move on to returning to where we stood, examining an invariant and two ways of expressing it, that we have an observation results to enforce, I think it's UCOM. And like I've got, basically I pulled up where we had the syntax that we had for both options last, and then some examples that will help us maybe evaluate some pros and cons of both options, because they both, at least in the initial testing that we did at the last profiling call where we were creating the expressions, both flagged from like a happy path perspective. And so what we're trying to evaluate this time around is whether or not, because they're written differently, are there scenarios where sometimes one would fail over the other, to help us evaluate which one we want to have in the profile. Is there anything else that folks would expect on the agenda that we should add for today? All right, so then I'll just do kind of a quick flyby on the discussions that we've been having in the governance stream. So originally came out of one of the discussions we had in the profiling stream a few weeks back to discuss whether or not we wanted to have maintain our tobacco smoking status profile, given it didn't quite match, I think, with the use case agnosticism that we have as a general rule in the baseline, and its very kind of degree of specificity of what's being put in place. And so we've been talking about, because we have a pending motion to remove it in some way, what our processes should be, and like what's the protocol we should be use moving forward if we have to remove or deprecate content. So we've kind of have gone through what our options are in the governance stream. We have documented some rationale for why we think the particular processes that we've recommended will be helpful, and then spent some time working on the last governance call on some of the sub-processes, like based on where an artifact is in you know, FMM level, does that change how we might approach, like whether or not we have to go to consultation with the community before we would deprecate something, or whether or not, like, what degree of notation does it require if it's FMM2 versus FMM3 if we were to remove something, like does it have to just go out on a call versus, you know, do we have to put it into our release log? So we've been kind of going through with a fine-tooth comb on the governance stream, and ultimately what's the result will be is I think really twofold. We'll have a pretty well thought out process that is likely scalable to other projects, and that we'll recommend to HL7 Canada for any HL7 Canada specifications that are put forward for essentially a, you know, a process for deprecation that, you know, is logical and shared by our community. And then the second piece is we'll actually just take that kind of decision tree that we have and we'll play out the tobacco smoking status against it to say, okay, well, what level of maturity is it? Have we published? You know, what is our set of processes that we have to follow?
Certain. Does the process you've been discussing differ from the HL7 international process?
No, it actually follows it. The only thing that we have done is put in a little bit more specificity towards, I think it's like FMM2 or 3. One of them that HL7, because it focuses very much on like the normative, what should you do if this is a normative content that is being deprecated? We wanted to make sure that we were also examining non-normative. So kind of following the same guardrails, and then I think putting a little bit more finer details against it to help us, because we tend to be a much more early maturity guide.
I'm sorry, I'm not understanding. Should I actually discuss this on the governance call? Would that be better, or?
Yeah, and actually one of the takeaways is that we're going to be putting out this is kind of what we've documented to date on Info Central ahead of the governance call too, for people to also react to, and as a kind of an opportunity to have that kind of prep before our next session, if rather than like digging into the nitty gritty of like this step, then this step, then this step, then this step on the profiling calls. So that was the other takeaway I was going to mention, is that if you were interested, I was just about to write up a post that just kind of captures what we have. I'll show it here real briefly. Captures what we've been kind of documenting here, and puts that out in like essentially a forum post for people to kind of look and react to and provide feedback on. So that's going out after the baseline call today, with the intent of essentially having our next governance call, kind of focus in on some of the finer details we weren't able to get to last time, primarily around, you know, whether or not we should be using kind of a cycle or a chronological time frame for, you know, once something is published with the deprecated flag, when it would get removed in the future, after it had been exposed as deprecated for X amount of time or cycles. So that's one piece that I think if you're looking at the forum post later, you will see is still kind of undecided, but it is one of the things that I think the group has kind of been going back to and hoping that we have some amount of kind of opinion that we can go into next Friday with. So that's the high level updates on kind of what we've been discussing on deprecation so far. Just shifting over to it, because we've got a whole dedicated call to it in governance. Something that we really haven't had a chance to talk through previously, but that, like, you know, we've heard, you know, asks from our community to kind of provide that representation and that that confidence in the amount of stakeholders that have come together and like developed our content. Folks that want to see effectively a contributors page or a contributor section in the baseline. And so we have a lot of kind of precedents and a lot of comparators in other guides that we can look to. Not everybody does this the exact same way. You know, some people say, you know, this is part of one big technical design group and you can read more about that here. Others, you know, explicitly list out authors or split up between kind of editors versus contributors. And so I pulled a couple just examples here so that you folks would be able to kind of see, you know, typically when other guides have, you know, credits or contributor sections or collaborator sections, they do fall on the homepage. And that's just kind of becoming a impromptu norm. And so I've chatted with Interpol a little bit a couple weeks ago to say, listen, to respond to the request that we have, can we start to add in a similar section to our markdown, get folks to kind of react to it and start filling it in with whatever we can find on like our old call logs and our subs at the point about 4 years ago when we had like further substreams for entities and medications, and there was a generic clinical one, gathering everything that we could from there, and getting like a starting list going. But part of what we want to talk to you about today is like, how do we continue filling this out? So we've kind of tried to pull from like sources and minutes where we could, but we also know that like part of the generation of our list is also like the folks that we hear kind of speaking up and that we've got documented in our minutes, and that's not a fulsome picture of kind of what we have in terms of contributors. So we've got like I'll show it to you in like the kind of text format, a starting point for like our section. I think regardless of the last question, which is, you know, how do we vet this? How do we ensure that we have all the right names on this? Because there's some people that contributed early and that, you know, might have shown up for the first 2 years, but haven't been on a call since. And so we aren't necessarily having that conversation with them now. And then like questions around like, does the categorization make sense? Do we like that the separation between like authors and editors and contributors, and does the logic for that make sense? You know, do we want to order it a different way? Basically, because this is a collective artifact, you know, what we can do is like throw some spaghetti on the wall and then just work with like, see what sticks and try to like refine what we have. But in terms of, maybe I'll start with like the categories. So looking at what we had a kind of a precedence for in the past, and that we have folks that contribute both from a profiling and a governance perspective, we tried to put forward like really two categories that were oriented around like the technical documentation. So you've got like authors, and then you've got editors. So authors are going to be, you know, anyone that was involved with the actual development of the spec, the initial kind of development of the profiles, any of our stream hosts. And the difference between like authors and editors are, we've also had people that have kind of come in and said, oh, I can deal with that. I can put in a pull request. I'm happy to take on that resolution of that ticket. And so these are people who are putting in, you know, technical corrections, but are more of like an ad hoc nature. And so I'm going to pause there. Like, does that separation make sense? Is it unnecessary to actually have the separation if we wanted to have a single one? Do we like the wording and the logic? Reactions. Anybody hate it?
Yeah, I like it.
Okay.
It's similar to what we used to do in the V3 days. And I think it's appropriate to recognize the contributions of people on specification.
Yep. Okay.
And
So
I think the
authors, editors.
separation between authors and editors, I think, is reasonable.
Okay. The last category is contributors. So it was actually super easy for us to say, okay, let's look at the GitHub commits and let's just see who makes the list for editors, because there's just like, there's a log, right? With contributors, this one was a little bit harder. And we had to pull from particularly like the old minutes, the meeting notes, and then just like going off of like vocal contribution. So who's showing up as like pitching in to say, okay, this is what we're experiencing in Manitoba, or this is what we're experiencing in Quebec, etc. So this is the area I anticipate that we're going to probably need to like continue editing the most, because we know that obviously we do have a lot of folks that come in and out. And it's probably the place that's the most subjective. And so my initial thinking is like, it's still really, really meaningful, even if you're not an editor, to be able to separate, listen, like, these are folks who have weighed in and helped us refine things and put in requests or put in issues, even if it's not the same folks that are actually like addressing those issues. But my thinking is that like, we'll probably have to have a process to say, you know, this is our starting list based off of like what we could pull from the meeting minutes, but like have some means of saying, okay, send something to this email if you want to be added, or, you know, ping us in the Info Central forum, some way of allowing for folks to say, okay, hold on, let me skim through this. Does this make sense? Am I missing from the list? And to get added.
Is that any different from other ballot feedback?
Like to request to be added to the contributors?
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, so the reason you asked is could we publish what we have and ask people to provide that in the ballot?
Yeah. Or people who feel they were slighted can ask to be included.
What do folks think?
Yeah, I agree. And it would be informative content in the document, and therefore the only thing that someone could lodge against that would be a comment, right? So they couldn't vote negative on a spec by virtue of
Makes
an
sense.
accidental addition or removal of a name. But that would be an effective vehicle for somebody to say, hey, can you add this to it?
Yeah. I mean, as we're finalizing the content for ballot, it doesn't hurt to send out a note asking people to self-identify ahead of time. I think we have done that on many projects. I wouldn't necessarily go into huge effort, just because there will be so many of us, and we can encourage people to speak up if they've been missed.
Mhm.
Because the other question is the names that you already have identified. Do you need their permission to include them?
Or, how do, so blank permission to include them, and if it's, instead it's like exception based, how do we collect that? Do we think that we do need that? I mean, if you have shown up on calls, if you've registered, if you are part of the meeting minutes that have indicated and you're contributing your perspective, we're not tying anyone to a specific organization here, which I think is actually distinct from what we're seeing in some of the other contributor section where they actually call it out. Because I know one of the things that people have asked for in the past is to say, like, I'm going to speak from my personal experience. I'm not speaking on behalf of X. Does that make a difference in having to ask folks for implicit consent?
Honestly, I think that given that the names and stuff appear in like our minutes, like we always had a list of attendees and stuff. I mean, historically we've done that. And those things are already publicly visible. Isn't kind of implied that it's already okay. I mean, if somebody's got a problem, they can just speak up and say, hey, don't put me in there.
Yeah.
But,
I'd agree with you. I just wanted to ask the question.
Mhm.
Yeah, no, I agree. And if your name being out there is a concern, you should use the name that the Witness Protection Program gave you.
So
I'm gonna pick up on a different issue though, of not including organizations or including affiliation. I assume some people participate at the request of their organization or the forbearance of their organizations. And so do those organizations want to be credited?
independent or connected to a person's name?
I would assume connected to a person's name.
What do folks think? How might we operationalize? Well, I guess if we're working through it like order operations, do we think that makes sense to have a column for organizations if folks want to kind of opt into that? And how might we operationalize who is comfortable putting forward their name or their organization against name?
What we've done in the past is list either the name or the name and organization together, if that's what the individual indicated. Typically, we do the same thing in minutes.
the difference between having just the name and having the organization there is typically you're going to need permission from the organization, or the person's going to need permission from the organization to stick on there, rather than the name that's kind of implied.
So we've always made that the responsibility of the individual.
Yeah, I mean, but that's why I'd say for putting the organization, that should be that they should request it to be added or something, rather than by default adding it.
I think it's probably easier to not add it by default. I'm thinking purely from there are so many people on this list that have changed organizations since starting with us with the baseline, that it would be really, really hard. And I thought the same thing about emails. I'm like, I don't know what people's emails are now. But I mean, maybe it's an opt-in thing.
Maybe we can include a working group like governance group, the baseline profile working group, the profiles of the governance, like just put in the working group, which group they represented or contributed on behalf of. That could.
So
Then
right now
option.
they're combined. I think it's like if we do a split to governance or profiling, there are a lot of people who are in both, and sometimes it can actually be hard to know who's in what. So sometimes, like if we look at the registrants from Zoom, a lot of folks might show up in both places, but we actually might see much more engagement some folks on governance and much more engagement of some folks on profiling. So we might actually get like double ups if we tried to separate it out. But we do have like a call out here, like, you know, this list is either governance, we could say, or profiling, or.
Yes.
Yeah, and you don't want this to become more work than the spec itself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Would we
know?
consider adding organizations like not tied to a name, like InfoWay, ChiHi, Alberta Health, Ontario Health? Because even while people may have moved back and forth, I mean, and in some cases, those people are here because their company is saying, yeah, we want to be involved in this.
That
Yeah,
gets really difficult times.
Yeah, and I would argue that specification work is done by people, not by organizations. So I appreciate the organizations providing their people. But I don't know that we want to start just listing organizations.
Well, there's the angle that you get input from certain organizations' points of view too, but that's much harder to determine than just participant. I mean, like obviously we've had Alberta, we've had Ontario input, but what other jurisdictions?
Could we do something like with support from the following organizations?
Then you're probably going to have to go back and get organizational approval, and that adds another layer.
As soon as you have to do that if you're going to show organizations, no matter what, you'll have to do that, get approval.
Well, we could do, like, you could still do the opt-in, right? Like if an organization decide, like, so if this is, and I like the idea of like saying, hey, as part of our ballot, we're gonna ask for feedback, just so you know, there's gonna be a section, we want you to provide this feedback. If you don't see your name on the list, or you're from an organization that wants to see representation, that's kind of like, it's self-selective, right? People opt into it and either you get approval if that's what's required, or you don't. We could do that.
I would use that approach.
Are folks comfortable with that?
The work challenge that's going to start to come with this, though, is you put the document out for ballot, right? XYZ Corp comes back and says, well, yeah, but Bob, who was working on that document, now works with us. So we'd like to be listed on the document. Yeah, but it didn't work for you when you contributed to the stuff. Yeah, but he works here now. Right? So then we're going to need to have a process for being able to allow and deny, etc. And this then sort of elevates the amount of work. I mean, in the B2, B3 specs, we would list individuals in the organization. We'd list co-chairs of the overseeing committee and their organizations. If someone didn't wish to have the organization listed, they could change the listing to just be their name.
Unless
But
we,
we never went and did a formal step with the organization getting their approval to appear. And I don't recall, in 20 odd years, I don't recall any corporation coming back and objecting.
I would
Official
agree.
analysis done wrong, yes, but not on specifications. And go ahead.
I was gonna say, I would agree, and, you know, unless we have a objective way of evaluating contribution, such as, you know, a $sign, then it becomes very difficult to figure out which organizations contributed. So for example, EC Group, did they contribute? I don't know. That's, you know, I just picked off Derek Ritz's company. So, you know, is that a company that should be listed as with support from? I don't think there's any question about ChiHi or InfoWay or, you know, some of the Alberta Health and a couple other jurisdictions, but it's once you get beyond that, questioning, did they contribute?
The other thing is, in the long run, we want to position these things as an HL7 Canada specification, being blessed by HL7 Canada processes. So, I mean, I think we could go too far down the rabbit hole on the organization side.
I dropped in the chat what gender harmony, the wording that they put in there, because that was the other one where I was involved.
One, it's just super cool to know that like Canadians were so impactful on that as an international round. Just throw that out there. I'll put this just in the notes real quick so we don't lose this. So I think what we have effectively, like right now, we were basically saying, you know, list either your name or your name and org together, allow people to kind of opt in. If we're concerned about like who makes the cut, who doesn't make the cut as a separate organization of support, maybe we just leave it at this. And it's like, if you want to put your org out, let us know, and it'll be attached to your name. Otherwise, like, it's not like it's set in stone. If, especially as we get more and more folks that like go more towards maybe endorsement, we can always do another lift, you know, after the ballot to say, oh, you know, do we expand this to say, here are our endorsers, and have that be its own process?
I would not include endorsers of a specification or implementers of a specification within the specification.
Yeah, we used to have it like in a slide deck, but that's fair. So right now, is there anyone who's saying, yes, actually, we still do want to do this independent process to solicit organizations, and this is what it would look like to get that answer? Distinct from, I guess, this piece up here, which allows you to kind of put your name and org together.
I think we should just stick with the first point, because as Paul pointed out, the maintenance of that's going to be a nightmare if we start doing anything more.
Yeah. All right. Is there anything else that we should be considering before we move on to looking at invariants together?
I'd rather not see the list on the front page of the IG. I think we've got several pages or several things of what would in a traditional book be colophon, the credits and copyright and things. And this seems to me to be similar, and probably goes in a about menu or something like that, with maybe on the front page a link to that.
Given where it's located on the page right now, I don't see a problem with it being there because it's right at the bottom.
Yeah.
Is it?
Yeah. So, and I'll show you US Core too, because I think US Core is the only one that might actually have, I don't know, they don't have separate credits. Okay. So both of them are following the kind of authors, contributors on the home at the very bottom approach. So this is the current list that we have in that slide deck. And oh, they just have this part at the end. Maybe it's Australia that I'm thinking. I'm really surprised. I feel like I'm driving most of their web traffic that it wasn't in my shortcuts. Okay, yeah, so they've got their collaboration. So, I mean, I think I've seen one that has a separate credits or something like that, but I think this is pretty innocuous.
Yeah, the gender harmony one had a separate page with a link just because there's so many people.
So what do folks think? Do we want a separate page, subpage, put it somewhere else?
I think it's fine where it is.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and I guess the only thing that's distinct about this one is that like these are individual lines in a table as opposed to this is like one big table put together. Are folks have any preference there?
No, the one table together is kind of hard to read.
Yeah. Heard someone speak up there.
I was gonna say, a single table and potentially even running the names together on one line.
Like this one.
Yeah,
Okay,
to make
I'm hearing a
it
split
Yeah.
then.
No, this table looks good. It provides a description as well.
This one?
The
Yes.
description's good enough, but if you could make the names like at least have a little space between them or something, that organize them in a grid in there or something. Just to make it more readable, because the big long flowing string is really painful to look at for anything.
But we want a single table that calls out descriptions and ideally has names in one cell, but spaced out somehow.
Like you could make it like 4 columns or whatever in each cell. Something like that. That'd probably be enough space on each line to put names and not make it too huge.
We will see if Interpol can work some magic. I don't know about subtabling in Markdown, but I know who I can ask. So what we can do is maybe come back to the group. We want to raise this on governance as well. So next we'll see if Interpol can kind of put some thinking behind if there's a way of combining them and then having more separation. But maybe we can show what the option would look like on the next governance call.
Would they still be left in alphabetical order, which it appears to be?
Yes, yeah, it's
Okay.
alphabetical right now by last name.
Okay.
And it can be, what I will say is like with the Markdown, it's almost a little bit easier to do alphabetical if everything's in one cell because you can use an alphabetizer and then just copy the
Yeah.
whole thing in. I'm gonna just put a note here. And so everybody's cool with the alphabetical by last. Or is anyone not okay with that?
It's good.
Okay, I'm gonna put a note in for myself. All right, anything else before we play around with invariants? All right. So recap real quick on, we've been working to apply a change that was previously motioned in the profiling call to effectively reduce some duplication that we had in profiling mechanisms that were enforcing the utilization of UCOM, as well as put in, or I say enhance the rule using invariance to effectively flag as a warning instead of an error, a hard error. And so where we left off the last profiling call, we had been looking at and had been testing 2 distinct expressions in FHIR that both accomplish the same thing. Oh, sorry, Joni, you've got some backfeed. So these are the 2, you can clearly tell I have not been able to run my publisher because these are basically noted right now. And I've got both loaded in the FHIR path tester. And so just to kind of recap where we were, effectively both say to some degree, and the ordering is different with both. If there's a value, if your observation has a value and that value has a type of quantity, and there's some value quantity dot value is populated, then there's an expectation that value quantity dot system will also be populated and that the system will be units of measure. And the goal of this would be, and this isn't because these are the options and they haven't been written in, would be for these to flag warnings. The alternative, so this one is they both use wheres, but they effectively accomplish the same thing. I think it's just with a slightly different order. And me see, apply system exists and system, oh, and just a little bit of shortcutting around having to kind of repeat the actual path that the expression is intending to follow. So we tried them both out last time on, let me pull it up, on a example that had a value quantity. And so we did the happy path testing to see, hey, do they both work effectively the same way at catching missing or a non-UCOM system in a example that has a value quantity. So I'm just going to quickly show you guys that once more because I had to do the check to make sure everything was still working. So example of an observation. This one we are expecting to evaluate to true because we know that it is an observation that has value quantity, that has value populated, and that has system. So it's true because system is populated and system does equal units of measure. So we know the thing that we tested last time was if I change this to no longer be what it expects, will it evaluate to false? It does. If I remove it, will it evaluate to false? It does. And I think there was one other modification that we put in as part of our kind of happy path testing last time. It might have been, I don't even know if you can not supply a value. Let's see. So if you don't supply a value, it doesn't pick it up, but that's because it's anchored around value existing in the first place. I think this would be kind of unusual behavior.
Yeah, the only time you'd see that is if the value is then supplied by an extension or something.
Yeah. And there was one example that Elliot brought up that we would want to test against both, which would be components as well. So before we pull up, because I've got a component one, I have a non, so we said, can we test it? So we've tested it with value quantity, both work the way we expect. Can we test it with a different type of value, like value codable concept or value string, and see what happens, see if there's any like bad, cascading issues with either of them. And then can we test it with component? Basically he's trying to say, can we force this thing to break? And will that help us determine which one we like better? So I'm just, before I do that though, I'm going to pull out the other one, which is this one. So this one is just a little bit more simplified. And I am feeding the FHIR path the context right now that it is occurring in observation. But this is the starting point to that value quantity one. It should evaluate to true. And it does. When I do the same modification, it should evaluate to false. And it does.
Shouldn't there be brackets around after the implies and around the two system things?
This one?
Yeah, like right there, an opening one there and a closing one after that.
That's what you're thinking?
Yeah, something
Okay.
like that.
Let's try it.
You want to imply both of them, right?
We'll try it with the vanilla first. So this is, we would expect to evaluate to true. And this one actually returns us the value. So because the FHIR path depending on how you write it, would return a Boolean, which is what we would be using for an invariant to indicate, an error or the warning that it had been met or it hadn't been met. But it can also be used to like actually query content out of it. And I don't know, I'm not an invariant, or I'm not a FHIR path person. So does anyone know why the parentheses inherently change this to actually be more like a query rather than a Boolean response? I always thought like implies,
No.
yeah, was kind of sticking, like that was one of the ways that we evaluate Boolean, but I don't know why. Were there other modifications that we wanted to try before we try to effectively break this, like by throwing examples at it?
I mean, the key thing you're trying to distinguish here is you want to be able to issue warnings.
Yep.
Not errors in the event that that there isn't a UCOM entry. Right?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, because I know Joni and I were just talking about this a couple days ago. We were talking about the fact that like sometimes in Canada we have value quantity and people are expressing that using like there's some SNOMED codes that cover areas of UCOM that like aren't part of the value set, like not cups, but like capsules. There's something in the actual implementation that we don't want to error out in the baseline if we've got folks that aren't all using UCOM every single time.
Yeah, and if you did want to say, I want you to use UCOM every time.
Yeah.
Then you just need to make it UCOM required at the
Yes.
top, at the head end, and that would do
Yeah.
it. It would generate errors if there wasn't one.
Yeah, then you could just do it with a required binding, but that's not quite
Yeah.
what we're here.
Niall, I see you raised your hand.
Yeah, so it's Neil, by the way, and I'm
Sorry.
representing Smile Digital Health. Just wanted to mention the parentheses, the final parentheses we added earlier, and it evaluated as the actual value here is because it's closing at the first where. So you're pulling the observation, and then the implies is just when it becomes true inside the where, then you're pulling that whole value of type quantity.
Ah, that's super helpful. Thank you.
And that wouldn't happen with the longer version, but I think this is a cleaner look. So personally, I prefer this latter test.
Shall we try to throw some codable concept stuff against it and see if we get what we want to get? We can keep coming back and modifying it. So I've got the erythrocyte example in right now. It's got value quantity. This is one. These are all just examples from the base spec. So or at least most of these are examples from the base spec. This one is a value codable concept. It is checking for the presence of Staphylococcus. So if I copy this one in, and I go back to our FHIR path. So value is going to be populated here, but it's not going to be a quantity, but it will have a system. It just won't have quantity where value exists. So we think this is either going to be like, do we think the way that this is written, it will result in a false? Because sometimes it can also result in nothing, which I think is weird, but it might just be the FHIR path lab. Or maybe another way of asking that, we can just see. So this one does. So this comes out to false, which would mean in this scenario, this would be a warning, which is interesting because I thought this is only targeting things with quantity. Just going to make sure that that's not hiding anywhere. It's not. Let's try it with the other one and then maybe come back to figuring out why we think it's flagging.
Sure. When you put the parentheses in, you put that in beginning at system and ending after units of measure or parenthesis, right?
Previously?
Yeah.
Yep, it was.
You'd gone there.
I did this and then I did that. Oh, hold on. And I did this.
Oh, you did put it the complete. Okay, thank you.
Yep, that was how, and that was what was returning the value previously. Okay, so this evaluates to false. Let's try it with our other one. So the reason ultimately we're doing this is not just because it's important to learn how our invariants work, but also because I think sometimes we can write an invariant a certain way, put it out into production, package it, and then if folks are running like their examples against our package invalidation, we want to know how this is going to behave and maybe what's going to be the best choice for us that performs the way we want it to perform in a variety of contexts. So let's just take a look. So I haven't modified the example at all. This is the value codable concept one. We don't get anything flagged, which is interesting. So it's not even a false. So the first one would essentially issue a warning. And when it's empty, I think that's basically saying nothing happens, right? I don't issue a warning from an invariant perspective because it was never evaluated as being,
Yes, well, we don't have a value of type quantity.
yeah. So why do we think we get it here? And is there anything we can improve about this to make it targeted better? Because I don't think we like the simplicity, but I don't think we want every observation with a value to flag as a warning.
No, we only want observations whose are a value type quantity to flag.
Yeah.
Right. So that correctly didn't give you an issue, right?
Well, this gave us a false, which would elicit a warning, or at least it would elicit the same behavior if as a value quantity whose system was not UCOM, which I think we want to be able to have that differentiation. But nothing like to me, and the other thing we should probably do is let's test this. I've got the version on my desktop and we can test both. Just to see.
Is it just returning false because it doesn't find a value type quantity? Because then exists is false.
Let's see. So this one is saying evaluation error. So I'm getting something different. Invocation of type, resource type name may only appear in the root. So it's unhappy about this for some reason. But that might just be a system. Let's go back to here. So Randy, you were referring.
Find like the part where it says of type quantity. Well, that's not true because it couldn't find one. And so the dot exists on that. Is it just saying false because the of type quantity doesn't exist?
Let's
I
just
think so.
try something. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just agreeing with Randy. I think it's because it doesn't exist, and we have, even with the implies, the value exists is evaluating as false.
So if we remove that, does that help us validate that hypothesis? If this,
Well, you need to put in an and relationship, I think, which would.
So and would replace.
Rather than a direct reference to the item, which is going to fail because it doesn't exist, if you put in an and relationship to it, then hopefully the first expression dies and short circuits the testing of the second expression.
So it's actually not doing implies at all. It would be.
Well,
And
yeah, and doesn't test the other side of the and.
system exists and system.
And that depends on how they wrote their FHIR path interpreter, but it should short circuit.
Let's see. Oh, it's expecting something from this.
So you needed to,
So take that back.
You said parentheses here.
yeah, no, sorry. What I'm saying is you had observation value of type quantity dot where, right? And it failed on the where part. So you need to, instead of, you put an and instead of a where.
Does this need parentheses now?
It probably, because I'm not.
This actually,
sure of,
technically this was implies before.
Yeah, and leave that as implies. And yeah, right parenthesis. Now, which val?
Let me actually just see. I'm going to pull up the original one because I might have modified something too much.
Yeah, and I'm not sure the order of precedence of an and implies. And should go first.
Okay. So where did you want and in this one?
Right there, where you put the end.
Okay. And then do we need actually this closure or not?
Yes.
Okay. Let's see.
Sorry, Do you need the parentheses around the value exists?
Right after the value exists.
Well, if you're going to open it at the beginning of value, you got to close it after.
Yeah, and these are independent statements, implies system exists and system, and then this is the other one that is
But
still
but I
open.
don't know that those extra set of parentheses around that adds anything for you.
Yeah. Let's
You
try it
need to-
both ways.
You
So,
maybe need
sorry, go
those
ahead.
parentheses before observation,
This guy.
put it there instead of in front of value.
Yeah,
Instead of,
yeah, and remove that. Perfect. Okay, now
So it's gonna say
now
those
we're
two,
not.
and
Now
then-
it's explicit.
I also removed this, but this doesn't have a closure elsewhere.
It doesn't have anything opening it.
Yeah. So this is not flagging now. Let's compare it to the other one. So it was where value exists. Implies system and system. What other, so if we went
maybe you need the where in front of that again.
where,
Just like the other one, it's a where bracket, like that.
not quite. Shall I copy what we have? And maybe the and like, is there an alternative way that isn't this where here, that other than the and that we want to try? Because we want to work from something that we know works and tweak it.
Well, look at what you have in front of the implies for the other way.
So this is how it used to be. If I can copy this as a,
Look at what you have from the top one, what's in front of the implies, and you should basically have the same thing, right? Or is that in the moving order?
so this is the, well, the top one was the one that, hold on, let me just see. This is the one that evaluates to false. The top one is the one that evaluates, well, it doesn't actually evaluate, which is what we want.
What I mean is look at the where, the start of it, you got where in brackets, observation, blah, blah.
Yep.
And then up to implies.
Okay.
So if you use that at the front, does it work?
Where value, hold on.
So I take the implies and everything in front of it from this one and put it onto the other one in place of the implies and everything in front. Or is that
So
gonna break us?
removing where value exists and replacing it where with implies.
No, what I mean is what you have on the line 270, everything to the left of implies.
Yep.
Use that to replace everything to the left of implies on line 273.
Okay.
Now, it might break this part after in the implies, but
Let's see.
you have an extra bracket after in front of the exists on the second line. It's this observation back again.
But that, hold on, actually. Let me just pull up the example that we know should flag as true real quick. Oh, wait, 1 second. Okay, so interestingly, that modification actually makes the thing that previously was true now false. So right now, we know that this one, which is more wordy, but this passes the happy path and one of the, like this value quotable concept issue. Value quotable concept is this one. Do we think that that is enough that we should continue testing for? Does it also work for component? Like, this might be an indicator that while it's more simple to read, that it takes the other option that we have out of the running. And at least for right now, if we can continue to prove that the first one that we have meets all of our expectations for other scenarios. Because we knew like part of this was like to say, hey, is one better than the other? Are there things that they don't respond well to? We know it works. This one is the value quotable concept. Do we want to try it with a component? This is just the IPS component that I pulled up that has, we might have to modify this really quickly, but we can try it with the value range component and then modify it to like a value quantity too. So because this shouldn't flag value quantity, we would also expect the same result. It wouldn't be false or true. Just shouldn't pick it up basically, which is true here. Is there a rule that you can't have a value and a component in observation?
No,
Should we try to Frankenstein one in?
Frankenstein a rule or
No, Frankenstein, add value quantity and see if there was an observation that had both component and value, if it would still be able to be evaluated.
sure. My concern with components is that they repeat, and there's a risk that you might get the value existing in one and the system existing in another.
But right now it won't transverse component, right?
Right. But if we're talking about components, that's where I think the challenge is.
Mm-hmm. So let's try this test, and then what we might have to do is do you folks think, so right now this one works if for components, if value, like basically if value quantity shows up, it's going to look for it. It's going to apply it regardless of the surrounding information. Do folks think we're happy with what we have, or do we think we actually need to apply the same rule to the component value as well, and should focus on making that modification the next time? Because right now, go ahead.
I think it should be both on value and component.
And potentially it might be distinct invariance, right?
Yeah.
So I'm going to put in our notes that this one that worked for all three scenarios, and likely the one that we're going to be putting in at this for CA baseline results too. And that we will come back and see basically like copy and paste this as one that targets component as well, and see if we can create a similar result. Everybody happy with that? Anyone not happy with that?
That's good.
Okay. About applying to component value. All right, I will save this and I will see many of you next week. Thanks, folks.
Talk to you later.
Thanks.